Are you wanting to heal your relationship? Or maybe you're not sure, but you'd like to explore the idea, and that's led you to this podcast. I'm Morgan Robinson, and my husband Brad is an international affair recovery expert. Together, we founded Marriage Solutions, a multi-location group marriage counseling private practice devoted exclusively to helping couples heal and rebuild their relationship to stronger than ever before. In fact, we're the best reviewed couples therapists in the Midwest. Check us out at mymarriagecheckup.com.
One of the most consistent findings is that men and women do markedly better in all measures of specific and general well-being when they are married. Compared to any of their unmarried counterparts, people do generally better and specifically better being married than unmarried. So married couples are healthier physically and mentally, and they live longer, and they enjoy a more fulfilled life, and they take better care of themselves and each other. He says this has been shown consistently over decades, but is rarely mentioned in the popular debate on the family. Hey guys, it is Brad Robinson with Healing Broken Trust. I'm going to be solo today. Morgan is watching our son. He has woken up early from his nap, and so it's just going to be me. I want to talk to you guys, though, about really just talk with you about things that you need to know or you need to consider if you're thinking about divorcing. And so this is I've accumulated some research. I've spent a lot of time researching this. Even though this is a very short podcast, I've spent hours researching this. And what I came up with is some interesting studies and facts that I've been familiar with. It's kind of funny how we spend all this time researching and we kind of come back to what we've already know. But I want to leave you with some interesting research because I want you to think about this if you're in that process of deciding, should I divorce or should I stay? As we've talked about before, in the 7 stages of healing after an affair, there's the moment of discovery, which is very traumatic when you find out about the affair. And then after that, there's the period of ambiguity. Should I stay? Should I go? I'm uncertain what I want. If I even want to stay, I'm uncertain if I want to stay, what I want out of our marriage. And so here's some research, and I'll just dive into this. And so I want you to have all the information as you make up your decision with this. And I think this is really important. This was some research done in the 80s. I would assume it's still the same today. 86% of unhappily married couples who went ahead and stuck it out instead of divorcing, 5 years later, their marriages were happier. They rated themselves as happier. Now, according to that same study, 3/5 or 60% of the couple of those people who said they were unhappy before were now very happy or quite happy in their relationship when interviewed 5 years later. And so what this research shows us is that we can be really unhappy in our marriage, like right now, there's an affair, or we've contemplated having an affair. And if we say, you know what, we're going to stick this out, we're going to work on this, research shows us that just 5 years from now, we're going to end up probably being happier. There's an 86% chance of just being happier, period. There is a 60% chance that we're actually going to end up being very happy or quite happy. And so I think that's really profound because, oftentimes people have this false notion that, if I divorce, that's going to be the end of my unhappiness. So if I leave you because of what's happening right now, I'm going to end up being happy. But research is actually showing that people aren't any happier. They're actually just as miserable as they are in an unhappy marriage 5 years down the road. I think that's really important because a lot of things in our culture talk about, you hear things in our culture or in the media or books. In fact, there's only really a handful of books written on like the case for marriage or the case against divorce. Those are a couple that come to mind, or one called Don't Divorce. And 2 of those 3 I just mentioned are actually written by the same author. So there's not a lot on preserving your marriage and trying to work it out. There's actually quite a bit on, hey, you know what? You can leave them. You can find a happy life as a single person and marry up in your second marriage. And, what the research is showing, though, I like to deal with reality. I like to consider myself the truth seeker. And, sometimes the truth isn't really what we always assume it's going to be. In second marriages, the research shows that 60% of them actually end up in divorce. 73% of third marriages end up divorcing. And so oftentimes the truth of the matter is the grass is only greener where we water it. The grass is greener where we choose to roll up our sleeves and get to work and say, this is where I'm going to water this thing and I'm going to make this work. And sometimes what happens, I've seen in my office is, one person says, okay, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to get to work. And the other person just ignores it, ignores her spouse. We don't have that big of issues. Our problems we'll fix on our own. I don't want to do it. I don't want to go talk to somebody. I don't want to pay that kind of money to go embarrass myself by talking about our problems. But the problem is with that is if your spouse is ready to go and you're not ready, they start to get burnt out. And so, so oftentimes I will lead somebody into my office for marriage counseling because the one who was ready to get started decided, you know what, I was ready a year ago and you weren't willing to do anything. So they get kind of burned out. And so what ends up happening is that one who was, the distancer, they become the pursuer and they are motivated. They've seen the light. Lightning has struck them. They've had an epiphany. And so, if you're in that position of, I really did roll up my sleeves and I did try, but they weren't willing to meet me halfway, I would say, let's give it a second chance. Let's try it again. Let's give it a third chance because the research is showing that 90% of people who feel like divorcing, so if you feel like divorcing right now, 90% of people a year later were glad that they didn't divorce when they thought about it. And that ranges from people who were newly married to people who have been married 40, 50 years. And so if you're thinking about divorcing, I would say, let's wait a year. Let's try to work on this. Maybe you've tried to work on it. Let's keep trying because the research shows that divorce, the grass really isn't greener. There's a lot of research that shows people do feel more self-reliant after divorce, but they're not any happier. They're actually just as miserable as they were when they decided to divorce. So when they were miserable in their marriage, they actually 5 years later are just as miserable as later on their own or in a different marriage as they were, because happiness is really, a lot of this is dependent on our own. It's not dependent on, another person really can't make us happy. And so a big part of this is, let's wait, let's slow down. Other research has shown that divorce is really traumatic for children and that it's actually okay to stay married for the kids. That may not be like, we're staying married for romantic love or I'm passionate about this marriage, but it's okay to stay married for the kids if that's where we're at right now. Because what will happen is we're going to end up choosing to stay married because we do love each other. And so those feelings do come back. The love does come back. We do find ways to work through our negative cycles, but we've got to let some of this ambiguity, some of this crisis, some of this uncertainty die down and we can work through it. One of the things that I've talked about in the podcast with you guys is, should I leave my spouse? Should I not leave my spouse? They're involved in an affair. They won't end it. One of the things that I told you guys in my experience is that people will wait it out. And I don't tell people what to do. I'm just reporting to you guys what people do because this is too big of a life decision for me to throw in my 2 cents. So I'll talk with people like this is sometimes what people do. This is what can happen if they choose to say, you know what, I'm done. Let's just move on. Sometimes that wakes people up. Sometimes people will just wait it out. And kind of this waiting out, the research is showing that, people do end up turning back into their marriage when people choose to wait it out, when they're in a bad, low period. And a lot of things in our culture, we're much more empathetic and compassionate, and we're not as judgmental as a culture now, which carries a lot of good things to it. But we also don't have too many sources in our culture say, hey, slow down a second. Let's really think about this. Let's take our time. I know this person really hurt you because they betrayed you. And this may not be the first time they've done it. They may have done it before. So let's slow down for a minute. We've got kids. We've got other people who are counting on us. So let's just hold off for a second and really determine what we want. There's nobody in our culture really doing that. You don't find religion really doing that anymore. Like I mentioned earlier, like just an Amazon search, there's only like 3 books. There may be more. I didn't really try too hard, but there's only like 3 books on the case for marriage, the case against divorce, that are really kind of preaching the negatives of divorce. I'm sure there's others, but my point is this: really take your time to think about this, because has lifelong consequences to it that really end up causing people to really reconsider and wish that they didn't divorce. One of the lady who wrote, her name's Diane Medved. She wrote The Case Against Divorce. She also wrote Don't Divorce. And in both of those books, she tells a story how she originally was writing a book on life choices and, should you stay married, should you not stay married? And she's interviewing all these divorcees, men and women, and she's like, these people are miserable. On the surface, they seem, oh yeah, I'm happy, I made a great decision, my spouse was a SOB, they were a terrible person. But as she asked more probing questions, it became apparent, like, these people are really miserable. Even those who had ended up in new relationships weren't always really happy. And, there's this myth of this single life that I'm going to have great sex, I'm going to be socializing, my finances are going to be okay, all this, there's this myth that the grass is greener. And it persuaded her just, researching with these folks that have divorced. She's like, she really took a very adamant stance, really a very conservative stance, saying, you know what, divorce isn't good for people. Yes, there are situations where people probably should divorce, situations of severe domestic violence, battery, children being abused. There are situations like that. There may be other situations like that I didn't mention. That's ultimately your decision to make. But as you make this decision, you need to really consider some of these alternative facts that a lot of people aren't talking about, that aren't really, big parts of our culture in this conversation. Some other research, you're going to hear my pages ruffle as I'm going through this. So, it's a myth that people can have a friendly divorce. One of the research from the book, Why Marriage Matters, by Glenn Stanton, consistent findings is that men and women do markedly better in all measures of specific and general well-being when they are married. So compared to any of their unmarried counterparts, people do generally better and specifically better being married than unmarried. So married couples are healthier, physically and mentally healthier, and they live longer and they enjoy a more fulfilled life and they take better care of themselves and each other. And so he says this has been shown consistently over decades, but is rarely mentioned in the popular debate on the family. And so other research that shows, the truth is divorce hurts children, and even under the best conditions, divorce is still traumatic for them. There's some research that said, there's really very, 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 very few situations where children are actually better off with divorced parents. Some children are, yes, but that's more the exception than the rule. And one last thing I'll leave you guys with is that oftentimes, I'm a parent, Morgan and I are parents, we love it. And so making our children happy is one of our top goals as parents, is to make our son happy, make other children that we're going to have happy. But, obviously their definition of happiness is different than my definition of happiness. And for children, oftentimes parents, we think that, making my child happy means, I've got to be happy. I've got to be on top of it. I've got to have my act together, yada, yada, yada. That's me making my child happy. But what people fail to understand, and this is from Kathy Meyer, and she's also a writer on marriage and family issues, and what she said is that unhappy parents, what they fail to understand is that though they may be unhappy, their children are probably quite content and don't care if their parents don't get along as long as their family is together. So the major issue of happiness for children is actually having their family together, not necessarily mom and dad happy with each other. And so she goes on to say, a child's happiness is not dependent on their parents' happiness. A child's happiness stems from routine, having a home, having two parents. And so I think that's really a profound statement. So a child's happiness is not dependent on their parents' happiness. A child's happiness stems from routine, having a home, having two parents. Being able to count on these things, they need to be able to count on these things being consistent day in and day out. That's something to think about as you consider this. Obviously, you want to be happy, you want your children to be happy, but you need to think about happiness from their perspective. Happiness isn't just having two Christmases because you guys are divorced. Happiness is having consistency in a routine. And I would even say that goes for older children, adult children. I've had clients whose parents divorced when they were older, and it really rocked their world. It wasn't just young children who were still living with their parents who were deeply affected by it. And so that's some research. 30% of divorces, I'll probably end up closing with this. 30% of divorces are actually what would be considered a high conflict marriage, meaning there was not just domestic violence. About half of couples have some form of unwanted touching, but battery, where somebody's getting the crap beat out of them. There is severe emotional abuse. There is life-threatening things made. About 30% of divorces are couples like that, but also there's going to be like chronic addictions, substance abuses, extreme mental illness, and obviously the physical and mental abuse are about 30% of divorces. The other factors, the other 70%, are things like infidelity. Couples no longer feeling in love, emotional problems, financial problems, sexual problems, problems with in-laws, neglect of children, that's a biggie. And then you have things like job conflicts or communication problems or being married too young. Those are the other 70%. And so a lot of people who are divorcing, because there is 70% of these other issues that are important that couples kind of find themselves not able to resolve, about 40% of people who end up divorcing really, some research shows that they actually have the chance to continue to work it out, that they could still save their marriage. About 40% of couples who are actually in the middle of divorcing, about 40% of them could still end up saving their marriage. And so I want to leave this information to you guys. Some of this, this podcast is all about healing broken trust. You guys can do it. This is what I do every day. This is what I and our team at Marriage Solutions do. We're the experts on this. And so you guys can do this. The other thing I'll just leave you guys with is this. It's one of my favorite stories or parables. It's told by Earl Nightingale, and you can look it up. It's called Acres of Diamonds. And after this podcast, you need to go look it up because it's really powerful. You may be able to find it you can find it on iTunes for sure, and probably even YouTube, but it's called Acres of Diamonds. And in the story, Earl Nightingale talks about a gentleman who in Africa, back when they were having their big diamond explosion, he bought a bunch of land, trying to, strike it rich. And so he bought all this land, and as he already bought it, and so he goes to investigate it. And he starts looking on the land, and he's like, holy crap, there's no diamonds here. Like, I bought all this, and there's no diamonds. I'm looking for it. I'm not seeing any of these sparkly gems. And so the guy gets despondent, he gets into despair, and he eventually kills himself. And so someone else, claims title to the property, inherits it, gets it, buys it. So they have a new owner. The new owner is checking out the land, and he comes across a creek bed, and he finds really large, what looks like pieces of like black coal, just like this coal he finds on the ground. And he actually had one of the largest fields, acres of diamonds in all of Africa. And if that original gentleman had just stuck with it and knew what diamonds look like in their raw form, he would have been rich. He would have been, one of the richest men in Africa and maybe even the world at that point. And he also would have obviously not died. He wouldn't have killed himself. And so the second gentleman knew what diamonds look like in their raw form. And under his own feet, he had acres of diamonds. And that original gentleman sold that land. Eventually he killed himself, but he kept looking for diamonds. He kept repeating that process, trying to find diamonds, and going from one plot of land to the other, trying to find diamonds, and he eventually killed himself with it because he didn't know what diamonds look like in their raw form. And so sometimes when we're struggling in our marriage and we're really at the crossroads and we don't know what's going on, we don't know what diamonds look like in their raw form. I would, as controversial as this can be to some of you, and as unwanted, as maybe you don't want to hear, maybe there is some diamonds that you guys can still mine in your marriage. Research shows that 86% of couples who are really unhappy in their relationship still have a very good chance of, turning it around to being happier 5 years later. And that 60% of the unhappy group isn't just happier, but they're quite happy. They're very happy. And so I would say that's also possible for you guys. I'm going to go. Thank you for this brief session of Healing Broken Trust. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Healing Broken Trust podcast. Go to healingbrokentrust.com and sign up for the masterclass today. As always, this podcast is for education and informational purposes only.